Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Drive Pink Dialogue. It is Thursday, September 26th. It's a beautiful day to talk about Inter Miami. My name is Scotty, and I am joined with my co-host, Saur. How are you feeling tonight, my man?
It may be a beautiful day wherever you are, but here in DC, it's awful. It's raining, it's miserable, and it's cloudy, and I don't like it. But nonetheless, not having a bad week. It was a rush of footballing games over the last couple of weeks, and it's nice to have a little bit of downtime before we go again, starting this weekend. But I'm good. How are you doing, my friend?
I got the flu shot this morning, and it has kicked my butt. It's the first time I've ever gotten a flu shot, and I just thought it was you just get the shot, and then you just go about your day. I didn't realize that you had negative consequences to that. So I'm happy to be talking about Inter Miami with you because it's going to be the most fun thing I've done all day, and hopefully it will get me mentally into a spot where I can enjoy the rest of the evening. What's on your mind for Inter Miami? We have spent the last 2 weeks doing almost as many episodes of this show on YouTube or on the podcast. We have talked about every game in great depth, pregame, postgame, and that multiplied by 3. We come away with 5 points from 3 games last week. We are getting ready to do another 3 games in 8 days situation over the next 10 days. And so I just kind of wanted to check in with you, see how you're feeling about this team. On this episode, we'll talk about Chris Henderson. We'll talk about the MLS roster update. We'll talk about the Open Cup. We'll talk about the CONCACAF Champions Cup. We will talk about some players coming back from injury. But I kind of want to just do a vibe check before because I think it's fair to feel a lot of different ways about Inter Miami right now.
We've had way too many Inter Miami games in the last week and a half, and I feel like we're drowning in Inter Miami content right now. But you know what? I love it. It's enjoyable. It's fun talking ball with you, listening to everyone around us discuss Inter Miami. And you mentioned that it's okay to feel a few different things about Inter Miami. And honestly, I feel all of those things, possibly even simultaneously. I have a little bit of an Inter Miami identity crisis going on because there are some days when I'm really frustrated and I think to myself, this team is capable of so much more. This team is capable of just absolutely blowing other oppositions out of the water. And yet we sometimes stumble and struggle to get good results. We haven't necessarily seen this team in full-fledged form. I remember that Orlando City game that gave us so much hope as to what the season would hold for us. And it's been difficult for many reasons when it comes to injuries, when it comes to missing players through international break, not having our superstars around all the time. But then I think to myself, we're top of the league. We've won more games than we could have ever imagined. We're doing fantastic. Everyone is pulling their weight. It's not like we're reliant on any one player to get the results. And overall, we're spoiled as Inter Miami fans, given how well our team has been performing. We're getting results left, right, and center. And even when you get a draw, it just feels like a loss, which is a good place to be in. So it varies how I feel about Inter Miami. I feel like at this point in time, as I said, it's a bit of a seesaw. Today, I feel a little bit skeptical about my team, but hopefully the conversation that we have today might change that a little bit. And I'm hoping the game of the weekend cements our spot as the number 1 team in the MLS, because I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, and for the record, the Columbus Crew lost the Campeones Cup against Club America last night, and so we got saved. The entire MLS Twitter sphere claiming Columbus as the best team in the MLS or the best team in MLS history or whatever it is they claim every time that Columbus does anything of note. They lost. We also saw the Open Cup final last night. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, but just getting into the first topic because I wanted to start light, and that's this new hairstyle that is going around Inter Miami's striker room. First, it was Campana who cut his hair and dyed it white, and now it's Luis Suarez. And I will remind you, when Campana did it, he went on a goal drought, and I'm worried about that happening to Luis Suarez now that he is a white-haired man. And by the way, he looks like a grandpa.
I will say, I think he pulls it off a little bit better than Campana did.
He does. That's
And
because he has the natural vibe of a grandpa anyway. So the silver hair just kind of worked for him.
yeah, I'm a little bit confused about this. I don't know. In the picture that I'm looking at, it looks fine. He's got a nice hairstyle, good flush hair. Uh, but again, if history is anything to go by, Inter Miami strikers with white hair don't necessarily do too well. So hopefully the curse of Campana doesn't trickle down to Luis Suarez, especially at this point in time when we actually need him to score goals. Yeah, honestly, that steel gray look, not a great fan of it, but he pulls it off fine. He pulls it off fine. I thought it'd be much worse than you described it. So
No. He looks sharp. He just looks like he has grandkids, and that's fine. He's clearly going to pull off the silver fox look when he's that age. But I don't know. It's just it's not what you expect from a professional athlete. But here we are.
you've played sports, haven't you, Scotty? Of course you've played sports. Have you ever been part of a team that has a ritual where every time you reach a certain milestone with your team, for instance, make the playoffs or reach the final, every single person in your team has the same hairstyle, whether it's going blonde, whether it's going bald, whether it's growing out your hair, whether it's having a rat's tail, everyone does the same. How awesome would you feel if every single player in Inter Miami dyes their hair white? And I might add that Cello Wigan also dyed his hair blonde at a certain point during the season, and he went in an absolute mess of a form.
Yeah, I don't know if I hope they win. I hope they win the MLS Cup and do that, and then they fix it.
That'd be pretty cool
by next February.
Like
Actually, if they win MLS Cup, they can get whatever haircut they want. I don't really care. I just don't want it to affect Inter Miami. And again, it felt like Campana dyed it to try and freshen up his game, and it didn't really work. And so I hope Suarez just comes out banging in goals with his new grandfather's strength that he is clearly trying to develop. Okay, next topic. 22 under 22. This is MLS's award that they give out to try and rank, or the media around MLS gives out the award. They rank the 22 best players under 22 years old. Hopefully I explained that without rambling too much. And some of the people that vote for it have started to put out their ballots. And do you want to guess who's been almost unanimously number one?
Yannick Bright?
No, I haven't seen him listed on a single one. But it's been Diego Gomez. And from everything I've seen, it's not just that he's number one, but that it's obviously him and number one. There's a big gap between number one and number two. Just to read you off some of the other names in the top 10, Diego Luna, Real Salt Lake, good player, but has not had that sort of impact. Federico Redondo, who we've seen a lot for Inter Miami. Benjamin Kramaski has gotten in that list a little bit lower than he was last year, but Toto Avila is also getting a lot of love. So Inter Miami is well represented on here, but Obed Vargas for Seattle, Christian McFarland for NYCFC, Jalen Neal for the Galaxy, Quinn Sullivan for Philadelphia, Chris Brady from the Fire, Esmir Baraktorevich from New England. These are some of the names. And when you think about it, a lot of those guys, and we've faced a lot of them, we've gone on the pregame show and said, this is a guy with a lot of potential. Look out for him. He could spark. You might see the beginning of his rise in this game. But there's not a lot of players, with a few exceptions, that are like established, legitimate starters on their team that are like impact players. Chris Brady is an exception. Jalen Neal, maybe. Diego Luna, definitely. But certainly none of these guys are vying to be the best player in the entire league at their position like Diego Gomez is. And so I look at this list and I think Diego Gomez is going to win the best under 22 player in the league this year.
Yeah, it's not a surprising fact that Diego Gomez is actually leading the pack. For some reason in my mind, I had a few other players who I thought were part of the 22 club, but they just miss out. I mentioned Yannick Bright. He turned 23 this month, I believe. So he doesn't qualify for the list. Ricky Puig will always be 16 in my mind, so I feel like he would always qualify in my head. But from the players that you've listed out, Diego Gomez is, as you mentioned, the overwhelming favorite to take this award because he's just been that good, a class above the rest of them. very mature in the way he's handled this season. The hype around him was quite heavy at the start of the season, especially with his form for Paraguay, and everyone saying that he's going to actually come out firing. And a lot of players of his age could just crumble under that pressure, not deliver, be under a lot of scrutiny, and he's just gone above and beyond every single game he's played. If he hadn't gotten injured at the start of the season, he would have been, I think, locked down from the very get-go. Like, there might be a question mark right now, but he's been phenomenal all season. And one thing I'd like to mention is Inter Miami is known for its superstar players, but I don't think any other team has put out that many under 22 starting caliber players on this list as Inter Miami, which is a source of pride because you and I both, I think, really enjoy promoting our youngsters and making sure the youngsters get the opportunity, especially when they deserve it. And it just feels like this season, it might be underrated, but a lot of our youngsters have actually had a breakthrough season.
Yeah, and listen, I will just remind you guys, this is not the official list. This is just some of the people that vote on it have sort of put out their ballots and kind of explained why they did what they did. And I love the transparency. It's not the final list, and who knows how many people are actually going to do this. And of course, the season still has a little bit of time left. But yeah, Gomez, I think, has been a standout, and he's been such a standout that the hype hasn't actually mattered. And I think one of the things you see when you look at this list is the transfer fee to bring players in mattered if they're a U22, and it's the amount of national team hype of players gotten if they're coming through the academies that also played a big role in here. Guys like Kevin Sullivan, who's the 14-year-old for Philadelphia Union, he's on all of these lists. Guy like Christian McFarland from NYCFC, I talked about him in the pregame show last week as a guy that would be really exciting if he comes on. He's played 7 games for them, and only made 4 starts in his career, right? Now he's 17 years old. He's a very exciting young prospect, but he's only played 7 games. So it's not only about impact. A lot of it is about hype. And that's why I think there are a lot of names on here that haven't had the sort of impact as guys like Yannick Bright, who maybe he did just miss the age cutoff, or another guy, Ian Frey, who has certainly been incredibly impactful, but because he doesn't have the incredible pedigree from his youth national team days, which didn't really exist because of the injuries and his sort of emergence later on, or a big transfer fee attached to his incoming into the league, he hasn't really gotten the hype, and I haven't seen a lot of support for him on this list, even though I think he's been a lot better than some of these guys who are more potential than actual production. And I think the same logic applies to Federico Redondo, who has been relatively high on a lot of these lists. I see him in the top 5 in a lot of these lists, and I don't know if he really deserves to be that high. But again, when you get an $8.5 million transfer fee and these media people aren't watching every minute of every single game, you can kind of get the sense that this is just a big player that deserves to be high on the list because he's getting a lot of minutes.
Yeah, I think with Redondo, it's a little bit more hype than actual production. And I have no doubt in my mind that next year he's definitely going to prove his worth. But at least for us who've seen him play regularly in and out, he's a good player. He's definitely a very good player, above average in that midfield, but he leaves a little bit to be desired. And of course, I don't want to go on a tangent about Federico Redondo, but there's just a lot more potential that we see out of him. And I don't think you disagree with me when I say that we would almost view him at the same level as Diego Gomez, or we would want his performances to be at least at that level because we value him very highly. So I think it's going to come with time, but I just don't think he's ready yet to be part of that conversation. And that's all I'm going to say on Redondo. But overall, I think this list is going to be dominated by a lot of Inter Miami players. 3, 4, I can sense 5. And that's how it should be.
I absolutely expect to have 4 Inter Miami players. I think all 3 U22s in Gomez, Aviles, Redondo, and then also Cremascu, who is also a U22 player. We kind of briefly touched on this as we get to our next topic, but this is the new roster that Inter Miami and all MLS teams had to publish to give a little bit of clarity to the fans and a little bit of transparency. MLS did this for the first time back in March, right at the close of the January window. I guess that may have been April, to give a little bit of clarity. And I think part of that was in response to how people felt Inter Miami must be breaking the rules to assemble this type of roster. And so everyone in MLS had to sort of publish what they were doing. But they updated it after the close of the most recent transfer window, or I guess the free agent signing period ended. And there are a couple updates that I think are at least worth talking about. And the first is that Kramaski is now listed as a U22 player. We don't know exactly what his salary is, and maybe we'll get more information on that when the MLSPA releases their final numbers later on this calendar year. But he got a new contract, and it feels like the type of contract that's Inter Miami showing him, we believe in you and we want you to be a key part of this team moving forward.
Yeah, and I think this new contract brings him at par with some of the other players that we've spoken so highly of. Listen, he's a fantastic player. We love Benha. He's a homegrown player, and he honestly deserves this contract as much as anybody else. We don't want this to be another situation where you give a player a contract and the next season he leaves. I do think Benjamin Kramaski is destined to leave Inter Miami for Europe sometime in his career over the next couple of years. We discussed about this contract, and we said, and you mentioned particularly, that this might push his timeline a little bit further back in terms of when he leaves for Europe. So it just means we're going to get to see more of Benjamin Kramaski for Inter Miami. And next season, I want to see Benha play a lot bigger role, obviously. But also, I think he has the capability to be a bit of a leader in that midfield. And he's got good experience at a very, very young age and can produce the result for Inter Miami. Last season was his breakout season. This season, I know Tata Martino is being cognizant of putting too much pressure on youngsters, and he's one of the players who has not suffered from it, but has a bit more condensed game time, which is fine, understandable. But next season, I think, is going to be huge for Benha to absolutely establish his role in that midfield. And I can see him being one of the undroppables for us, and I hope that's where this contract leads him.
Another thing I noticed that I just wanted to point out is that Yannick Bright is listed on the international roster slot list, which means he will take up an international roster slot for as long as he's here. He wasn't listed there in the spring version of this, and I'm imagining, sort of thinking back, that's because he maybe hadn't signed yet. As you guys may remember, he didn't sign until right before that New York Red Bulls game because we were still trying to figure everything out. And so maybe that's the reason, but I don't believe he was listed on this last time as a international roster player. And so that is new. And then lastly, Leo Campana downgraded from DP status to TAM status. His contract doesn't change. Nothing about his role on the team changes. It's just that Inter Miami was, I think, always able to buy down Campana to TAM status, but they felt as long as they could use him as a DP, they might as well. And now that the roster rules changed, as they did at the beginning of this most recent transfer window, Inter Miami has adjusted where they put their money and where they put their allocation money. So Campana, now a TAM player, which means that in theory, Inter Miami could have gotten another DP this summer. We talked about big names, especially at the defensive spots like Cesar Montes, but again, freeing up a spot for next year. We'll see if they decide to go the four U22s, 2 DP route, or 3 and 3 when they get into next season. But for now, it is interesting to know they have options. Of course, they complicated that by adding Benjamin Kramaski to that U22 list. So it's all kind of uncertain. I imagine Kramaski wouldn't be too hard to get down because one of the things that makes some of those other players really difficult to get under sort of back on into a normal slot is because of the transfer fee and the amortization of the transfer fee. But with Kramaski, obviously no transfer fee, just salary. So I imagine there's some wiggle room there. But the reason I mention all of these complications is because of Chris Henderson. We will get back to Chris Henderson in 10, 15 minutes because we want to spend some real time talking about him. But as we talk about making this roster work, getting the international roster slots in place, getting the senior and supplemental roster slots, organizing your U22s and your DPs to ensure that you have the right amount of TAM and GAM and all the other allocation money designations. That is something that Chris Henderson has done a wonderful job of doing since he arrived. And so I just want to set the table for our upcoming conversation about him. But before we do, let's talk about what happened last night, because there was 3 big games. None of them were MLS games, but they all included MLS teams. First, and not really interestingly, the Canadian Championship, the Cup for Canada, ended, I guess, I didn't even realize this until 20 minutes ago, but it sounds like Vancouver won. So they are the Canadian champions. As you guys may know, all of the professional clubs in Canada compete in that, and that includes the 3 MLS clubs based in Canada. And they generally win it every year. And they have, as a result, booked a trip to the CONCACAF Champions Cup. The same can be said for the winner of the U.S. Open Cup, which is the U.S. version, which also happened last night. And LAFC defeated Sporting Kansas City 3-1. I believe LAFC was already qualified for the CONCACAF Champions Cup because of their
Final.
runner-up finish in the Leagues Cup. And all of these things together meant that Inter Miami qualifies for the CONCACAF Champions Cup. The last one is the Campeones Cup between Columbus and Club America. And of course, Columbus lost that in penalties. And I've already mentioned that. The reason I bring all of this up is to tell you Inter Miami's qualified for the CONCACAF Champions Cup. We have mentioned this as a perk of winning the Supporter Shield. We have mentioned this as a reason to continue to push and to get as many points. And that is one of the perks of winning the Supporter Shield and breaking their points record and all that. But Inter Miami said, we'll just sit back and let every other team do it for us. Inter Miami qualifies to the CONCACAF Champions Cup. How you feeling about that?
Well, at least there's less jeopardy if we decided to absolutely have a disastrous last few games and not win the Supporter Shield. So at least that's not going to be an issue. The biggest issue we're going to face if we don't win the Supporter Shield is not being drawn at home and then having to play Cincinnati and Columbus maybe back-to-back even throughout our playoff run. So having locked that CONCACAF Champions Cup slot is massive. I think it's going to give a bit of a boost to this team. We were definitely one of the favorite teams to win it this year, and we bottled it, let's be honest. For whatever reason, the game didn't go our way. We weren't able to handle the Mexico crowd. I don't think the team was hot enough at that time in good form to be able to handle that sort of pressure. Tata Martino didn't have his greatest performance in the CONCACAF Champions Cup either. So there were a lot of issues surrounding that. And I think next year we might just be better prepared to deal with starting the season off with the CONCACAF Champions Cup. I think this team's going to be in a much better place overall. So I'm excited to see us there. I think we deserve to be there generally. I think we would have already made it through if, by virtue of us winning the Supporter Shield, which does look like it's going to happen. But it's just good to know that we've secured that piece of qualification early.
Let's sit on here for a minute because I want to continue talking about the CONCACAF Champions Cup. You're right. We did not put our best foot forward earlier this spring, and I think we were very critical of Tata Martino in our reaction to that second game where he made no substitutions and he never really had a tactical setup that was going to get us the result we needed. And I think at least I put a lot of my blame and frustration on him in that moment. What I will say is that we had no Ian Frey, we had no Sergei Kristov, no David Martinez, obviously hadn't signed yet, no Redondo, no Yannick Bright, no Benjamin Kramaski, no Matthias Rojas, who hadn't signed yet, no Lionel Messi for the first leg, no Facundo Farias, obviously, no Robbie Robinson, and I don't believe Campana played in the first game. Going into the second game, Robert Taylor, you may remember, got hurt in the 30th minute of that first game, so he missed the second leg. Campana misses the second leg. And so David Ruiz is suspended for that second leg, and all of the injuries are the same. And again, Chelo Wiegand had only just appeared on the team, and so we were still sort of figuring out if we were a 3-5-2 or a 4-3-3 team. So one of the reasons we lost is because we did not have the personnel available to us to really put our best foot forward. But one of the other reasons we lost is because we hadn't built the type of continuity that we have now built and that we saw develop over the course of the few months after that. And you thought to yourself, man, if we could have had this health and this level of continuity and this level of chemistry and our coach understanding the team he has, we would have been much better suited to do well in that tournament. And so it does bring you to the question of how much should we try and improve this team moving forward into the winter, knowing that continuity, chemistry, these are all really important going into that tournament, which happens right at the beginning of the season.
I think one of the things you mentioned, continuity, is important, and that's what I was getting at as well. We forget sometimes as Inter Miami fans with how well the season has gone that this is a transitional season. Let's be honest. We had made a lot of changes to the roster. We had to make a lot of moves, a lot of different permutations and transfers happen in and out. We lost a lot of players, and that's how the MLS system works, anyways. But it feels like while this was a transitional period, we were trying to figure out who's best part of our first 11, what the role is going to be for every player. Some of those questions are going to be answered by the time we go into the next season. We know Aviles is going to be one of our starting centre backs, unless he has a phenomenal run of playoffs and he gets transferred out to Europe or something. But we know Diego Gomez is not going to be there. We're going to have to replace him. Benjamin Kramaski is going to be there. Yannick Bright is going to be part of that midfield. Redondo is going to be settled
Okay,
in.
but hold on. So let me stop you. Let me stop you. Because this is really only a question about 2 or 3 players, right? It's Cello Wiegand. Do you activate the buy clause and commit to him for the next several years? Right? Because if you buy him, he's going to be your player, right? You're not going to get him on loan for one more season or for 6 months, right? Do you bring Matias Rojas back, right? So it's not really a matter of reshaping the whole roster. It's just a matter of a few key decisions, right?
No, but I don't think those key decisions are going to impact the team itself as such, because we know for Cello Wiegand, we have a really good backup. So even if we don't end up signing Cello Wiegand, we know Ian Frey is capable of plugging in a much better manner. Even if we don't end up extending the contract for Matias Rojas, we do know what our midfield combinations could be without Matias Rojas in there. So those questions, I think, have become less of a concern, and there's less uncertainty surrounding at least the base foundation of what this team looks like. We know that Yannick Bright, Federico Redondo, and let's say Julian Gressel, we know what we're going to get out of them when we play in the midfield and what the issues are going to be. So it's not like it's going to be a completely different backline. It's going to be a completely different midfield. We know some certain combinations have played together. The team has much better chemistry than we did earlier in the season. So the foundations are there, and it's all a matter of building on that foundation. And yes, you're right that we need to make key decisions about certain players, but I don't think our form and our performance will rely entirely on the decision of whether Cello Wiegand gets signed permanently or not. We have a strong enough backup to plug in for him when he's not available. So you don't need to rush back a new right back when you buy them.
No, I understand. But you would assume if we don't re-sign Cello Wiegand, we're going to sign a different right back,
Yeah,
whether
but
they're
they
going to
don't
be a
have to
backup or
immediately
not.
come into play, right?
No, I understand. I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
The reason I bring this up, and I don't mean to sound dismissive, but I am trying to be dismissive. I just hope it comes off nicer. This team has recycled half its roster basically every single season since we were founded. And so the idea in my head that we're only going to sign 2 players and we're only going to lose 2 players doesn't really compute. And I get that there are teams like that, but everything I know about Inter Miami tells me that's not the case. Now, that also leads into this Chris Henderson conversation that we're about to have. There's also players from the B team that are potential candidates to join the A team next season. Guys that are already signed but aren't available include Israel Boatwright, Tyler Hall, Santi Morales, a guy like Brian Destin, a very pacey forward, Ryan Carmichael, a young striker that they drafted this past year. These are guys that, if room becomes available on the roster, you could see them getting a first-team contract. That also goes back to the Chris Henderson conversation, because maybe he was the guy that really pushed to get these young players signed. I don't know how good Tata Martino is at bringing players through from the academy, right? We think about everyone that has come from the academy, but all of them had sort of broken into the first team prior to Tata Martino's arrival. And guys like Tyler Hall, Israel Boatwright haven't really, I guess, lost in Sunderland a little bit, but we haven't really seen it a ton from Tata Martino. So again, this is all sort of part of Inter Miami developing what they're going to be next season. But I think it leads to this last topic that I wanted to spend some more time on, and that's Chris Henderson. Tom Bogart and some of the other MLS beat writers have talked about this idea that Chris Henderson will leave Inter Miami at the end of this season for Atlanta United, who is in a complete refresh. We talked about it when we played them. They have moved on all of their stars. They have brought in a lot of cash that they can spend moving forward. They brought in Alexei Miranchuk, who looks to be a really good player. But they fired their sporting director. They fired their coach. They are looking for a full-on rebuild, reset. And it sounds like Chris Henderson's name is certainly being floated around for that job. I don't expect anything to happen until after the season. But as we're talking about getting ready for next year, that could be a really big loss. He has been our sporting director basically since we got in trouble with the MLS police force for breaking all of the rules back in 2020. And he has made this team roster compliant even under the extensive sort of penalties and punishments that we had to go through. And while they might not have sounded particularly draconian when you just hear them as a casual, if you're the guy that has to make all of the math work, I'm sure it is incredibly frustrating having to deal with all of those penalties and the loss of allocation money and international roster slots and everything that we had to go through. And he guided us through that so that we could be a competitive, competent team, and also put us in a position so that we could afford to bring in Lionel Messi, Luis Suarez, Sergio Busquets, Jordi Alba. All of the players that we brought in the Messi era were only possible because of all the maneuvering he did to get the roster in a position to be able to handle that. And so this is a person that has had a huge impact on putting Inter Miami in a position to be where they are now. And yet Inter Miami went on to hire Raul Sanllehi from Zaragoza in Spain, who I think spent time with Arsenal and Barcelona before that, to basically be ahead of Chris Henderson. And so as we're potentially looking at the end of Chris Henderson's tenure, I guess I wanted to see where your head was at on this, because it feels like this could be a big blow or it could be absolutely nothing. And the fallout is really multidimensional.
When we say that Inter Miami has constructed the best roster in the history of MLS, that's not a joke. It on paper, at least, genuinely, this is the most deep roster, the most prolific roster that MLS has seen, both in terms of the superstars on the team as well as the youngsters that are coming through. This team would not have survived its lack of superstars midway through the season if we didn't have the quality and talent of youngsters that we do. And I think 90% of the credit for that, maybe even 100% of the credit for that, for at least constructing the kind of roster that we have, for making sure that everything fits into place, the credit for that goes to Chris Henderson, undoubtedly. Of course, coaching staff has some level of input into that. The higher management obviously has supported Chris Henderson in his understanding of how this roster needs to be built, but he's been phenomenal in the way he's gone about business. I remember talking to you at the start of the season. During preseason, we had the conversation about how Inter Miami is being accused of not adhering to some of the MLS rules. We don't understand how we're going to be roster compliant, where we're getting all these, players from, and how we're fitting them in together. And then once the MLS rosters were made public the first time, it all came to a head, and we understood exactly how this was constructed and all the details to that. And it's really mathematical and well constructed. It's like a puzzle that's been put together. And losing Chris Henderson is definitely going to be disruptive, for sure. I think it's going to be a big blow to us, just in terms of how important he's been constructing these, bringing in these players, putting this permutation of a roster together. And he obviously had a vision for this team that may get disrupted in the short term. But I'm hoping with the new director that we've got in, it's sort of taken away that transitional period, and he takes on the responsibilities of Chris Henderson once and if Chris Henderson leaves, and the transition is a lot smoother than we expected to. But having him leave at the start of the transfer window next year, when we need to reconstruct some of these players, because let's be honest, I agree with you that there's going to be more than 2 players leaving and more than 2 players coming in. There's going to be a lot of players who are going to have key question marks. So whoever the new person comes in has to make a lot of key decisions. If he decides to keep Chelo Wigan for another season and it doesn't work out, that's going to be on him. If he decides to not renew Matthias Rojas' contract and we can't replace him, that's going to be on him. We have to replace Christoph as well. There's quite a lot of decisions that need to be made, and not having Chris Henderson, who's been through this grind with us, who's helped Inter Miami out of a very important, sludge fest, is going to be a big loss for sure.
Yeah, and it does feel like if this happens, it's just going to be Sanyehi who sort of takes over the role, and he's probably already, the supervisor for that role, and so it would just be him that takes over. And he's never been in the MLS before, and that is a factor when you're talking about a rule set that is as complicated as MLS is, and especially if the rules are going to change slightly over the next year, which we expect as the MLS tries to continue to grow and expand. The young players. We have had a history of signing these young players to first-team contracts, and it has seemed to me to always be at the behest of the front office before the coaching staff. Just to, a few guys that were never really able to make that impact. Felipe Valencia never even made an appearance yet. Edison Azcona probably signed a little too early. Schneider Borgelin, Lawson Sunderland's only made 8 appearances. And then, of course, the more recent guys in Boatwright, Hall, and Santi Morales. Clearly, there was the intention of getting them into the first team, but Inter Miami has, in some cases, struggled to actually bring them through, at least in the time frame that they possibly were expected to. And I think that probably comes down to Chris Henderson wanting to get these guys signed and committing to them and having the program commit to them in the academy early and then bringing them through at their own pace. I wonder how that changes with a different man at the top in Sanyehi. I know that he is from Barcelona, and obviously the importance of the academy is in the bloodline of everyone that has worked in for a long time at Barcelona. But still, it does concern me a little bit.
Yeah, I think youth is a big part of Inter Miami. A lot of it comes down from the management and from the sporting director, but I think Tata Martino is not traditionally known as a coach who integrates youth players into the squad, but he's done it with Inter Miami. Let's be honest, he's given some of the young players an opportunity.
I disagree.
At least to an extent.
All 4 of them, all 4 of the academy players that play, Noah Allen, Ian Frey, Kramaski, and David Ruiz, had established themselves as first-team players prior to Tata's arrival. The only player you can say that about is Lawson Sunderland.
I was trying to give a little bit of credit to Tata Martino. Okay, we won't give him any credit.
Hey, we're talking about Chris Henderson here. Yeah, we're giving Chris Henderson credit.
No, but just in terms of having that influence and allowing some of the youth to flourish is very important. And I think it has to be part of the club's culture. And whoever the next person comes in has to understand that and has to promote that as well, because more than anything, the role of the sporting director is to make sure that the vision of the club is executed properly. And it is within the vision of this club to promote its youngsters, to bring up the youth, to develop its academy. And I think it's going to be very important, at least for the future of this club, because we're not always going to have our superstars, to make sure that we constantly produce this pipeline of good talent who has an opportunity to play for the first team. And regardless of who's in charge at the sporting director level, that regardless of who's in charge at the coaching level, this has to be a cultural thing for Inter Miami. And I hope that's how the higher ups, that's how David Beckham, that's how the directors view it as, and it's not going to change once Chris Henderson leaves.
Another aspect of Chris Henderson's term here is that I always felt that he did a tremendous job of getting the players that the coach wanted. And so you saw the profile of players that we brought in change dramatically when we lost, or when we changed coaches, right? From Phil Neville to Tata Martino. And where they were coming from changed dramatically. And you think about some of the Phil Neville signings, a lot of them came from Europe, right? Even the South American players like Leo Campana was playing in Switzerland, was playing in the academy in England for Wolves. And so it's a very different style of player that compared to what Tata Martino has brought in, which is basically guys he knows and guys from Argentina, and that his scouting network has informed him is both available and worthwhile for this level. I wonder if that changes when you get a different sporting director. Is there a clash of vision between the coach and the sporting director if you have someone else, right? We've seen Chris Henderson work wonderfully with the two coaches he spent a lot of time working with. But is that different if you have a different man at the top, and how can that cause dysfunction if there's anything there?
Yeah, and that's definitely a concern. And you're right to point out that Chris Henderson has worked really well with the coaches, to the point it almost seems like he's executing the vision of the coach, right? Rather than the club at large. Because whatever coach comes in, regardless of whether it's Tata Martino, whether he's someone from the English league, whether he's someone from the French league, they have their preferences for the kind of players they want to work with. Their networks, their scouting departments are all tailored to what their experience has been. So that's definitely going to be an influence. And Chris Henderson has done a brilliant job of making sure that he's adapted to who the coach in charge is and executed the coach's vision as much as the club's vision as well. So that for me is a very good point that you bring up, that whoever comes in next needs to balance the club's vision with the coach's vision. Otherwise, there can be a dissonance, and it can be very, very disruptive if that's the case. Another aspect of that is bringing in a coach who is more aligned to the club's vision rather than bringing in his own vision.
Well, okay, let me stop you again. Not to sound dismissive, but to be dismissive. No,
You've
just
been
kidding.
very dismissive of me this episode.
No. I apologize, but
guys, I am going to be filing a complaint with the HR department, and if you don't see Scotty next episode, that's because he's been benched for a couple of games.
Well, I'm sure I've deserved a benching over the last couple months, but not going to make any jokes from there. I just wanted to say something to frame this conversation, because I want you to continue on what you're saying, but I just want to frame it in a certain way. Inter Miami is a new club, and although the front office has sort of talked about building from the academy, has talked about building certain types of an identity, they've never really had an overarching theme to what they've wanted to do. At least it hasn't appeared that way, right? At first, they wanted to attract the Latin American audiences, particularly Mexico, and that's why they went out and signed Rodolfo Pizarro. That has seemingly been abandoned. But I think part of the reason they brought in Sanyehi was to establish an identity that goes throughout the club from beginning in the academy all the way to the first team. And that all came in after both Chris Henderson and Tata Martino. Chris Henderson has sort of done a good job of molding what it has been so far, and Tata Martino came in and along with Messi, created this whole revolution. But the entire identity really feels like it's going to be established by this new Raul Sanyehi signing, or bringing him in. And so as we talk about building through into the future, you can understand why Chris Henderson might feel like they don't need me anymore. You could understand why Tata Martino might feel like I have to influence this other person in order to form the identity of this team. And as we talk about building a true identity for Inter Miami that lasts, it's going to go through this new person and not through Chris Henderson, who has sort of been massaging it over the last couple of years.
Yeah, and that's the point I was trying to make about having a vision that runs through the club rather than piecemeal opinions and ideas that you sort of trying to integrate into one. And at the end of the day, I think this might just be one of those things where Chris Henderson leaving gives us the opportunity to sort of reset the club's vision of where we actually want to go. Because let's be honest, he's done a fantastic job of putting this club together back to, a functional capacity when it comes to being adherent to some of the standards and regulations of the MLS, being roster compliant and all of that. But I think Inter Miami in a couple of years will no longer be considered a new club. So we have to make sure that even if we have coaching changes, even if we have sporting director changes, there is an established identity that we can fall back on so that it's not as disruptive when you replace some of these people in new roles.
Yeah, and I think that's something that a lot of clubs have struggled with over the last several seasons, especially clubs that sort of came into existence post 2015-16, right? We saw Atlanta United have a ton of success going through these young South American players, and Joseph Martinez and Tata Martino even building this identity. And then it sort of faltered for them, and now they've seemingly given up on it. There's a lot of clubs that have had that same thing. Nashville going through an identity crisis right now and had to fire their coach. And so you're right. If Inter Miami wants to establish something lasting, especially as we know this era of having Messi is likely not permanent, right? I know they could possibly sign Neymar or, who knows who might be that person in 5 years, but you would imagine they're not going to have a player of this stature on a perpetual basis, right? And so establishing something permanent does feel important. And I guess you would have always thought up until recently that Chris Henderson would be a major part of that. And now it feels like he might not be. And you can understand why that would be the case. You can understand why he might want to go somewhere where he can sort of restart from fresh and sort of be that guy that establishes everything. But at the same time, from Miami's perspective, you could see how losing him would be a tremendous loss. He's one of the best front office people to ever grace this league, and what he did in Seattle was amazing, and what he's done in Miami, I think, has been amazing. And so, again, if this does come to fruition and Chris Henderson is going to leave, I think really we just kind of say bravo for everything. Thank you so much, and I wish you were going somewhere on the West Coast instead of in the Eastern Conference.
Do you think that calculus of him staying or leaving changes if we win the MLS Cup?
No.
Do you think the decision would be made regardless, right?
He has an MLS Cup with Seattle. So I don't think that's like a crowning achievement that he would wait around for to create. And I also think, considering the resources of Atlanta, right? I know you won't get Messi, but listen, he's spent the last 2.5 years recruiting Messi, right? He should have fully experienced the Messi experience. And so for him, I think it's probably just not loving the fact that someone was hired above him, and also, time for a fresh challenge, right? I don't know how much more can realistically be done with this Inter Miami squad. So I think that's probably what it is. And it sucks as an Inter Miami fan who watched this front office person have such a big impact on this club. And again, I don't know many front office people across the league. Like, I wouldn't recognize the person who does this for most teams, but I think most people recognize Chris Henderson for the effort and impact he's had on both Inter Miami and just in his entire career with Seattle as well. Okay, let's talk about these next 3 games for a few minutes, and then we'll wrap it up. Inter Miami back on Saturday. We play Charlotte at home, and then we go on the road for what I think could be the biggest, most exciting game of the year at Columbus. And then later next weekend, we will play Toronto at BMO Field to try and get the Canadian sweep. How are you feeling about this upcoming home game and then road trip?
Absolutely jittery, anxious, and I don't expect anything from this team. Honestly, it's going to be hard. It's going to be very hard. 3 games, all 3 games, quite difficult. Charlotte, I'm actually worried about Charlotte, man. I think they're going to be good against us. I think we're at home, so that's definitely a plus, but it's not going to be an easy game by any means. That Columbus game, and we've spoken about this, I have a very, very bad feeling that Tata Martino is going to throw that game. And by throwing that game, I mean not put out his best lineup, when I think that could be the game of the season, at least in regular play. I don't know if we win in our current form. I just don't think so. But again, this Inter Miami team has done enough to show that when the chips are down, they produce a result. And then we have the Canada experience finally. And I know you and I both have an eye on whether we're able to complete the trifecta, winning 3 games in the same season in Canada. So that's going to be an interesting one as well. Not easy by any means. I don't even know if Lionel Messi travels for that game. One good thing is that Busquets is going to be back in the lineup. So I've missed him the last couple of games in the midfield, and that's going to be very, very important. But overall, feeling nervous.
Did I skip the health update? Because I don't remember talking about it.
I don't remember you talking about it either.
Apologies,
guys.
guys.
You've done this. I told you, you're off your game today, man.
I think it's the flu shot, man. Yeah. Diego Gomez and Matias Rojas back in training. Busquets back after serving his suspension and then, getting engaged or whatever it is that real people do. 3 huge players for Inter Miami coming back to the lineup for Saturday night's game. And so when you think about not being in great form on the turf in Atlanta in front of a big crowd, Yankees Stadium / the Mickey Mouse Park, right? It is awesome to get 3 big players back to give your team a rejuvenation, a refresh, that was then, and now we're a different team because we've added 3 key players to our lineup. I actually think Charlotte is going to be a really important game, but a game that they're going to answer the call for, especially because it's at home, especially because it's a team that a little bit of a flounder right now for them. They played us competitively at their place, but that was us depleted in terms of not having Messi, Suarez, etc. And also it was us getting a 2-1 victory at their place, despite not having Messi, Suarez, and Matthias Ross. So give us those players back. Dale Gomez and Federico Redondo, I think, we're injured for that game still. And so give us all those guys back and let us go to town at home at Chase Stadium for what I think is the final meaningful, impactful home game of the regular season. I think Inter Miami has to respond in a positive way, and I think they will.
Yeah, and having Diego Gomez back is going to be absolutely crucial. As much as I'm going to miss having Robert Taylor on that left wing side, and then I'll be honest, I miss Matthias Rojas, man. He's been good in whatever role he's been asked to play. And he was in a good goal scoring form before he got injured. So it'll be interesting to see how he comes back and gets fit again and gets back into good shape. It'll be as much about making sure all of these players coming back are ready for the playoffs as much as getting the points and winning the game. So a lot to look forward to. And I agree with you that Charlotte game, we should be competitive and should be able to win, but it's going to be a tough one.
Charlotte did add a few pieces at the summer window, most notably Tim Ream at center back, and I thought they already had a nice core in defense. But then you mentioned it earlier, talking about that Columbus game. I am scared to death that Tata Martino is going to rotate that game. We saw him a week ago rotate 8 players for the midweek game, and I feel like he's going to do that again, and he's going to bunker. And we're not going to see what this team is really made of against this Columbus Crew team until the playoffs. And that makes me both nervous heading into the playoffs, but also frustrated as a fan who wants to see that game be the spectacle that it could be if we really go for it. And by the way, the same applies to Columbus. I don't know what Wilfred Nancy's rotation policy is, but they played last night. They're going to play on the weekend. So they're going to have played even more games in this sort of run compared to Miami. But you want both teams to go head to head and give it their best shot. And I would be disappointed if we don't get that.
Assuming that Columbus puts out their best starting 11, right? I think this is going to be the perfect litmus test for Inter Miami to measure where they are in terms of competing with the best teams. And I hope Tata Martino uses that as an opportunity to set the marker for the rest of the league that, yes, we are the team to beat.
And then that Toronto game, I think, really feels like the last game of the year for me, because we're going to have the 2-week October international window, and then we'll have that New England game, which should be, I think, a fairly easy game to win. It'll be like a preseason game for the playoffs. And I think everything in terms of the final standings will be finished there. So the result won't really matter. It's just going to be a tuning game. We're going to think about that game is how do we look going into the playoffs? The result probably not going to matter as much. And so I really feel like these last 3 games are it for the regular season. And again, I don't know how much confidence I have going into it. Can the team figure out how to operate well? Can the midfield figure out how to operate effectively? One of the comments we got post-game last episode or after this NYCFC game is this team feels like it's poorly coached. And while I don't necessarily know if that's the prime reason, I think when you see that, it feels like you're missing something oftentimes in the midfield. And it just feels like this team hasn't really connected over the last couple of weeks. So I agree with you, man. I think it's a really big 3-game stretch. I'm really excited to talk about each game before and after, as we always do on the pregame and instant reactions. And I'm just excited to get this team back. I got used to playing every 3 days, and now we had a whole week off. We started this episode by complaining about how many games we had, and now I'm thinking I wish we had more games.
No, please, no more games, man. I won't have time to do anything else.
Just wanted to go back to the chat for anyone listening to this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or your podcast platform of choice. We do these live on YouTube, and so we get some comments, and I just wanted to go back and answer some of the questions. Francisco says that we should look for defenders from Colombia or Ecuador. There's a lot of good ones for $1 million or less. Here's the thing. We are going to buy players that Tata Martino knows and likes, or that his friends know and like, and all his friends clearly live in Argentina. So the reason why we get so many players from Argentina is because he has old friends that he says, listen, guys, I really need a right back is there any right back in the league that would A, might be interested, and B, is good enough for the MLS? And that's how he gets these names like Chelo Wiegand or Matthias Rojas or so on and so forth. And so he's using his scouting network to find these players, and that's not a network that I think extends to Colombia or Ecuador, unless it's a player that he's worked with in the past, like we saw with Julian Gressel, like we saw with Cesar Montes. But that's sort of how it works right now. But of course, that could change. And one of the exciting potentials of this Raul Sanllehi hire is that the scouting department could become much less oriented around the coach and much more oriented around, let's just go find good, talented players.
As it should be.
As it should be, which I will admit is very difficult for an MLS club because, players have to be thinking about the MLS before. And so having those personal connections can make that a lot easier. Sveterix, sorry, you're going to have to hold me again. If Griezmann ends up going to MLS, he'll probably go to LA since he's linked with LAFC. I will say if Messi didn't come to Miami, I think Griezmann would already be at Inter Miami, and he would have come last summer. I've always felt that, and I think that I think he would have been the guy we would have built this team around if Messi decided he was going to go to Saudi Arabia or stay with PSG or whatever. But because we got Messi, the Griezmann thing didn't work out. Maybe he'll come at some point. I do think he wanted to come to Miami, but now there's all these French stars at LAFC, so I understand why there's a connection there. And I do think Inter Miami's probably going to look at a name a little bit bigger than Antoine Griezmann next summer, maybe from Brazil, but we'll see. Sean, and this is the one I really wanted to come back to. Sean says, is there a chance that Tata also walks at the end of the season if Inter Miami wins the MLS Cup?
I think if we win the MLS Cup, I don't think he's going to go anywhere. He's probably going to stick around until Messi's here. Messi is very comfortable with Tata Martino, obviously, and that's how it's going to be. If Tata Martino wins the MLS Cup, I think he's going to stick it out for another year. If he doesn't win the MLS Cup, then I think it's going to be a whole different conversation and a legit conversation to have, because the fans are going to have his head if he doesn't win the MLS Cup.
The interesting thing is I actually would be more interested in Tata Martino as coach in a world where we don't have Messi, because when you have Messi, you have to win every single trophy, right? Like that's the expectation and standard that comes with having players like Lionel Messi in the MLS. And I don't know if Tata Martino is the guy that can always make the right decisions in the biggest games, but I actually do like how he's built this team into a more coherent squad, that he's improved the defense, he's found formations that worked, and especially his ability to bring in talent. And I actually do like the way that for the young players that have already established themselves, I do like the way he sort of introduces them into the team. I think he's done a pretty good job there. And so if you give him the entire slate, and he can get all of his own DPs and everything, I think it could be really interesting to see what he could do. But again, that's just not the world we live in. And if he does win the MLS Cup, I don't think he's going anywhere, is my final answer. Yeah. Okay, Saur, it's been about 58 and a half minutes. We are going to wrap it up there. But is there anything that fans should be looking out for over the next couple of days, or anything on your mind that you wanted to give for the last word? I took so many of your sentences halfway through and I cut you off. And so I wanted to give you the final word.
I'm going to say in one sentence, hopefully, and not ramble on. This is the last stretch. Final 3 1+ game that's going to determine Inter Miami's season and how we play the playoffs and what's going to happen. There's so many records to be broken, so many records to be established, and we're almost there. Inter Miami is almost on the cusp of greatness. So tune in, stick with us, and enjoy the ride while we cheer Inter Miami on to the playoffs and see what's in store for us for the next 2 months.
All right, guys, we'll be back for the pregame show 1 hour before kickoff. As always, Saturday night, normal time, 7:40 Eastern is the kickoff against Charlotte. We'll be live at 6:30 Eastern. And until then, I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and let's go Herons. See you guys then.